Hello and welcome everyone. Today we are going to be looking at the second question in the Medicine Through Time paper, a question that you might have also seen if you study Weimar Germany, that being how useful are sources A and B for an inquiry into, and then obviously it will give us the inquiry focus. And with this, what we are asking ourselves is, does it teach us anything? Do these two sources tell us anything about the inquiry focus, and can we trust the information that it is giving us? For this question, you'll be trying to gain 8 marks, and you'll have a total of 10 to 12 minutes for this. And you want to be spending ideally 1 or 2 of those minutes actually analysing the sources that this question is built around. When you get into the exam room, this is what you will be looking at, and at the bottom, to kind of reinforce the structure, it says explain your answer using sources A and B, the content of them, and your own knowledge of the historical context, that being your own knowledge, what you know about the focus of the question. Now, in the mark scheme, it asks us to look at a number of things, especially in that level 3 response. The first one is that you need to analyze these sources and see if they include information on the inquiry question. If they don't tell you anything about the focus of the question, then obviously they're not useful. You need to compare them. You need to compare the sources to your own knowledge. If it agrees with your own knowledge, the facts that you know, then obviously the source is telling the truth and therefore it's useful. And also you need to take into account the provenance of the source and whether or not this adds to or takes away from the source's usefulness. And the provenance, what exactly provenance is, if you're not sure about that word, I'll go into that in just a short while. And most importantly, every single section, the orange, the green, the purple, they all need to link back to judgments on sources' utility. You need to say if this makes the source more useful or less useful. So the first question that we're going to look at, or the sources we're going to look at for the question as well, is how useful are sources A and B for an inquiry into the problem of trench foot. Now, when we're analysing source A, we need to look for content. Does it tell us anything about the problem of trench foot? The first thing we can see is the battalion lived in mud and water. The source describes the conditions that causes trench foot. Therefore, you could argue making it useful. It tells us that altogether about 200 men with trench foot had been evacuated from our section. This shows that trench foot impacted a number of troops and could lead to serious issues, once again addressing the inquiry. And finally, that men were sent 2 at a time to rub each other's feet with grease, and it's stating there the measures they took to prevent trench foot. So this source is absolutely chock-a-block with information relating to the inquiry question, so it is useful to us. But we also need to take into account the provenance of the source, and for this I have gone into the origin aspect. There are 3 sections: nature, what it is, origin, when and where it comes from, and the purpose of the source. All 3 of these things can impact its usefulness. The origin of this source is that it came from a captain who was responsible for his regiment, and because he was responsible for his regiment, he would have been well informed on the dangers of trench foot, because he would have been responsible for their safety and well-being, and so what he is saying is more than likely accurate and well informed. Now, when we flip over to source B, we can see in the image, kind of backed up there with the blurb at the top, the medical officer is carrying out a foot inspection, but we can see that trench foot was treated seriously, with regular foot inspections being carried out. And once again, for the provenance, I am going for origin again, and that being it displays the measures in place at the end of World War I. So this could limit its usefulness, because possibly this is not reflective of the entirety of the World War I timeframe. This could have just been a measure that was implemented in 1918, so it's not giving us the full picture, taking away from its usefulness, perhaps. Now, when you look at the overall structure, you need to cover 3 things: content, own knowledge, and provenance. And when you boil this down into a nice, easy to remember acronym, it becomes COP. So you need to look at the content first of all. Do the sources teach you anything about the inquiry question? If so, what? And therefore, is it useful? Is it not useful? You need to look at your own knowledge. Does your own knowledge support what the source is saying? If you know facts that support the source, it's telling the truth and therefore it's useful. If what you know disagrees with the source, perhaps it has some level of bias, it might be lying, therefore it is less useful. And finally, provenance, the nature, the origin, and the purpose of the source. Easier put, what it is, where and when it came from, and why was it made. All of these contribute to its reliability, its trustworthiness, and in turn, its usefulness. Now, before we go into answering the question, we need to remind ourselves about what exactly trench foot was. Trench foot is the painful swelling of the feet caused by exposure to cold, mud, and water. It could lead to gangrene, which is the decomposition of body tissue. And when dealing with trench foot, prevention was key. They rubbed oil on their feet. They wanted to avoid feet getting wet. They wanted them instead to be dry, and they changed their socks regularly. And finally, some top tips for this question. You want to address the idea of usefulness at every single section. If you do not address usefulness in that section, you may as well have not written it. I would ideally suggest that you look at each source individually. Look at source A in one paragraph and then source B in a second paragraph. And when you are addressing each source, do so methodically. First, address the content and then whether it makes it useful. Then look into your own knowledge and whether it makes the source useful. And finally, the provenance and whether that makes it useful. Now, I know I'm saying useful a lot in this video, but you cannot miss that step. If you miss that step, you will get a 0 no matter how perfect your answer is. So now we are going to look up a model answer that I have transcribed. So, source A is useful for an inquiry into the problem of trench foot. Source A displays the kind of conditions which would lead to soldiers developing trench foot. This is shown in the quote, "The battalion lived in mud and water." Furthermore, it shows how the scale of the issue that trench foot brought. This is shown in the quote, 200 men with trench foot were evacuated. This source clearly provides a large amount of information about the problem of trench foot, making source A useful. So in this, I've picked apart 2 parts of its content, backed up with sources, and then I have given a little sentence at the end just to link that to its usefulness. Moving on. From my own knowledge, I know that trench foot was a serious issue. When the second stage of trench foot set in, soldiers would be at risk of gangrene and in extreme cases, amputation. This clearly backs up the information put forward in source A, as it shows why so many steps were taken to address and treat it, thus adding to the source's reliability and to its usefulness. So with my own knowledge, because what the source is saying agrees with it, I know that this source is telling the truth, it is reliable, and therefore it is useful to me. And to finish with the provenance. Finally, the fact that the source came from Captain Impey, an officer of the regiment, means he would have had been well versed on the issues that were affecting his troops, and so the information put forward is likely factual, making the source useful. So once again in here, just a little sentence tying it to usefulness. Overall, the source's content and provenance, as well as it aligning with my own knowledge, all contribute to its usefulness. So as you can see in the sections underlined, I am constantly reviewing its usefulness and addressing it. This is critical to hitting that level 3. Every section, you need to link it back to usefulness. Now, when we look at source B, I've written a bit less, not the end of the world. I'm still going through the 3 sections and getting down all of the information I need. So, source B is also useful for an inquiry into the problem of trench foot. Source B depicts regular medical inspections of soldiers' feet. This is shown by the soldiers lined up with their boots off, while another inspects them for signs of trench foot. So as I can't quote an image, all I've done here is just describe the image like I am talking to someone who is blind and cannot see it. So to continue, this makes the source useful as it displays the kind of measures taken to prevent the serious threats of trench foot. Moving on to own knowledge. This agrees with my own knowledge as I know that prevention was key, and this was obtained from rubbing oil into the feet, in addition to keeping them dry and regularly changing socks. Thus, the fact that this source's depiction on prevention aligns with my own knowledge adds to its usefulness. Now, if I just stop here quickly, a key part to getting full marks in this question is that you need to provide one negative of one of the sources. You need to say something in that source that makes it less useful. So this is what I've done here. However, the source's origin, being 1918, only gives us an idea of the problem of trench foot at the end of the war. This means that we cannot be completely sure if these measures are reflective of the entire World War I period, thus taking away from its usefulness. Nevertheless, this source B is still useful for an inquiry into the problem of trench foot. So with that, I've addressed content, own knowledge, provenance. I've linked it back to usefulness every step of the way, and because of that, I can walk out of that exam answering this question, getting 8 out of 8. Now, if you want to pause the video here, I've provided 2 more questions with the sources attached. The first one being on blood transfusions, and the second one being on the work of the stretcher bearers on the Western Front. So once again, rewind, pause the videos if you want to attempt a question yourself. But to review some kind of concluding points, go through the structure methodically, first address its content, then link it to your own knowledge, then go for its provenance, always linking back for usefulness. Look at each source separately in a separate paragraph so they don't kind of merge into one. Make sure to give at least one negative of the source to be able to gain 7 or 8 marks out of 8. And just to restate, you must be sick of hearing it by now, but everything must link back to usefulness. If it does not link back to usefulness, you will get a 0. So thank you everyone for watching, and good luck with your exams.